So this lecture is going to focus specifically on REM, or rapid eye movement sleep. So what I'll do is I'll tell you about the relationship between REM sleep and dreaming, as well as brain and muscle activity during REM sleep, and finally a little bit about activity of various neurotransmitter systems during REM and systems that are thought to mediate the transition from non-REM to REM sleep. So we call REM sleep paradoxical sleep, and that's a very important principle to understand. And the reason we call it paradoxical is that the brain is very, very active during REM sleep. However, the body is not. The body is functionally paralyzed. We call it REM paralysis. It's obviously not true paralysis, but due to brain mechanisms I'll discuss in a minute, we have a complete lack of muscle tone in our voluntary skeletal muscles. So we can't move our arms and legs, our neck, etc. The only muscles that are active during REM are the muscles of the eyes, hence the term rapid eye movement sleep. So again, REM sleep is considered paradoxical because we have basically no muscle tone. We're essentially paralyzed. However, the brain shows a very high amount of activity, almost as if you were awake. So here you can see these are EEG traces from the eye muscles as well as the brain and the chin and arm and leg muscles and the heart during REM sleep. So what you see is that the bigger the spikes here, the more activity would be indicated. So you can see there's a lot of eye movement, hence the term rapid eye movement sleep. The EEG shows a fairly active brain as well. And we'll talk about what brain areas are active and which are not during REM sleep. And then if you look at the chin, arm, and leg EMGs, remember EMG stands for electromyography, so that's recording electrical activity that's coming from muscle contractions. You can see that there are some random twitches that occur, but overall there's not this constant spiking of activity. And then finally you can see the heart monitor. The heart rate actually does pick up a bit during REM sleep as compared to non-REM. So again, this is the paradox. We have a very active brain, heartbeat is strong, but muscles like the arms and legs are basically paralyzed. So a lot of us are probably familiar with the idea that REM sleep is when we dream. Dreaming, of course, would be these experiences we have during sleep of story-like episodes with plots and details, striking visual imagery, etc. So this usually happens during REM, although it's not 100% accurate to say that you can never dream during non-REM sleep. The difference is that non-REM dreams are usually isolated experiences like that feeling of falling, for example. Not so much that storyline that you can put a narrative to. And one way we know that most dreaming occurs during REM is that if you do a study in a sleep lab where you have people come into the lab and fall asleep, figure out when they've hit REM based on their EEG activity, and then wake them up, they will tell you that they were just dreaming. And if you were to do this on yourself, you could, every time you wake up, write down if you've been dreaming or not. And more than likely, it would be that whenever you woke up from a REM episode, you would have reported a dream. As compared to being awakened from non-REM sleep, most people would not report dreaming during that time. So what's going on in the brain exactly during REM? What areas are active and what areas are inactive? So imaging studies using techniques like PET and fMRI in sleep labs have told us that we tend to see higher activity in areas like the pons, the limbic system. Remember, the limbic system has areas like the amygdala, hippocampus. So that would be areas of the brain involved in learning, memory, and emotion, as well as high activity in the parietal cortex and the temporal cortex. Both of these areas have higher order visual and auditory processing that they'll do. Where we see less activity are in our primary sensory cortices, such as the primary visual cortex. So this would suggest that we are not actually seeing anything, but our brain is generating imagery coming from other areas like the parietal and temporal cortex, which is more where we have our memory for images versus actual perception. Notably, the prefrontal cortex and the motor cortex are also very inactive. It's not surprising that the motor cortex is not active because remember, we are not moving our muscles during REM sleep. So it makes sense the motor cortex would be asleep as well. It's interesting that the prefrontal cortex is inactive because remember that the prefrontal cortex is where a lot of our higher order executive functions come from. So things like reasoning and logic. And that part of the brain is not working during sleep. So if you think of all this together, it probably explains the fact that dreams often have a highly emotional content, very striking visual imagery that our brains have conjured up, but not that we're actually perceiving in the real world, and that dreams are often illogical. Things occur in a funny order. There's things that occur that are very unrealistic. All of that can probably be explained by this profile of brain activity. So what's happening in terms of different neurotransmitter systems? So there's kind of a complex interplay of increased and decreased activity depending on which neurotransmitter you're focusing on. So one thing we know is that there's an increase in firing rate of acetylcholine releasing neurons, and that's thought to modulate the transition from non-REM to REM sleep. So when we go from stage 4 non-REM into REM sleep, we see increased acetylcholine activity in the brain. In particular, the pons, which is in the brainstem or hindbrain, is where this acetylcholine activity seems to be the highest. And one piece of evidence we have to support this is that if you inject the drug carbachol, which is a drug that acts as an acetylcholine agonist, so it mimics acetylcholine at synapses, you can induce the transition from non-REM to REM in a person who's already asleep. Injecting carbachol into an awake person is not going to cause them to go right into REM sleep, but it will trigger that transition from non-REM to REM. And again, we think that the pons is the brain area where this increased acetylcholine activity is occurring to mediate this transition. Another finding we have is that there's increased serotonin activity is associated with interrupting or shortening REM. And so increasing serotonin would decrease REM sleep. That's actually something we know from individuals who take SSRIs to treat depression. SSRI stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It's going to increase the amount of serotonin in the brain, which is helpful for depression, but not helpful for REM sleep. People on SSRIs report that they do not feel refreshed after sleeping because they're not getting enough REM sleep. REM sleep, we know, is very restorative. We feel better when we get enough REM sleep. And so people with one side effect of SSRIs is interruption of REM. And finally, we see that increased norepinephrine activity in the locus coeruleus, which is part of the brainstem, and it's where norepinephrine is produced in the brain, can block REM sleep. So that makes sense because if you think about it, norepinephrine is the same thing as adrenaline. That's associated with wakefulness. And so you wouldn't want a high amount of norepinephrine when you're trying to have REM sleep. And so drugs that mimic norepinephrine would also interfere with REM. So you can think of serotonin and norepinephrine as having similar effects. If you increase the amount of serotonin or norepinephrine in the brain, you're going to decrease the amount of REM sleep. Okay, so just to summarize this short lecture, REM or rapid eye movement sleep is paradoxical because it's marked by a high level of brain activity while there's a low level activity in the muscles of the body. Secondly, we know that most dreaming occurs during REM sleep, and that any non-REM dreams are usually more like temporary experiences rather than dreams with narrative to them. And if we look at the pattern of brain activity that we know from imaging studies, this makes sense. Finally, the onset of REM is marked by changes in different neurotransmitters. In particular, increasing the amount of acetylcholine in the brain will trigger the onset of REM sleep, whereas increasing serotonin or norepinephrine would shorten or interrupt REM.